Well, good afternoon, everybody. Father Ben Brown again. Karen Wright filming at St. Ambrose Church-Cecilia. And happy to be with you and continue this lesson from my collection of catechetical pieces that I wrote many years ago, and share more today on the sacraments of weakness. But before we get going, a new costume. I've been mentioning the military uniforms and the idea of being in solidarity with so many people that we're seeing as first responders, military personnel putting up hospitals and serving in existing hospitals and serving in many ways during the crisis. I happen to be wearing today the uniform that I wore as a VA chaplain. This one from the VA hospital in Lexington. I served also at the VA hospital in Dayton, Ohio, and at least one summer at the VA hospital in Louisville. I came home from the active duty service career with what they call the credentials of working at VA hospital, and never did have a full-time job with them, but got a couple of part-time jobs while I was serving the parish in Springfield and serving as a chaplain and teacher at St. Catherine College. But anyway, hospital work, it's of course right in the in the heart of things right now. I guess one of the things I found myself tuning into is as the military has put up temporary hospitals and field hospitals. I guess I'll just kind of do my hospital work as a nut in a summarize it real quickly. My second full-time tour of duty on active duty with the Navy was to be chaplain at the main hospital at their big Marine camp at Camp Pendleton, California. So that was a everyday type assignment, full-time. That particular hospital had 3 chaplains. Some had more, some had less, and I did that from then 1997 to 1999. And within the staff of that hospital, this was kind of interesting, some of us were designated as the deploying hospital staff. So that if there was a time when we needed to set up a field hospital, then we would be the personnel that went with that. And that happened once after some terrible weather in Central America, that they deployed some field hospitals. And then, let's see, of course, throughout both civilian and military career, I've always been, a priest to be on call and make regular pastoral calls at hospitals. But that one at Camp Pendleton was a staff member. It was my full-time job. Let's see, in Kodiak, Alaska, which was the next tour of duty, that was one with the Coast Guard, again, a civilian hospital and a military hospital. More of an on-call situation there because it was a smaller situation. Well, I mentioned in one of these earlier broadcasts that the big ships, the amphibious ships, like the USS Baton, had their own sick bays, and I would not be surprised if we don't see them deployed even yet in the pandemic, because they can accommodate quite a few beds and be a hospital, a floating hospital, one that's accessible, for example, by aircraft, helicopters most particularly. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I came home in 2010 with the credentials to be a VA hospital chaplain, and was called on then at the one in Louisville, the one in Lexington, and the one in Dayton. So anyway, blessings out to all those who are on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly those in hospital settings today. The other thing I want to mention before we start into the lesson, as I look out on the pews at St. Ambrose, there is a difference than from yesterday. These pews have been only loosely attached to the floor, and so they've been very much out of line. And when I look out from the sanctuary, they're completely in line today, and that's because Joe House came and lined them up and bolted them down. And that's a project that we've needed to do for a little while now. So he was working alone for the most part and got those lined up. So thanks to Joe, and they're looking much better than they did. Sacraments of weakness. Oh, one other preliminary announcement. So the lab coat, in solidarity with the hospital staff, thanks to Joe for lining up the pews. And these lessons that I wrote back in the 80s, reading back through them, there's a couple of things that I'm noticing, and noticed especially today. One, that I have quite a few typographical errors, but two, that the substance of what I had to say there is not bad. There's some things I would tweak and maybe revise a bit, but this is a good time to do that too. And when I brought these out, many of you know the story about bringing them out of my physical files, written in 1987-88. These things are not preserved electronically, and many of you have heard the story about how they were pilfered from my car. I had them in a little briefcase that looked like probably a computer case, and somebody broke the window in my car and took off with them. And after about 2 days, I found them I didn't find them, but people in the neighborhood of Assumption High School and St. Raphael Catholic Church in Louisville found them, and I was able to get them back. The point is, I'd like to get them preserved. I'd like to get them digitalized. I'd like to get them, retyped and electronically preserved. And Susan Reynolds Bell, has begun doing that. I got a message from her just today saying that she'd be happy to resume that project, but it is pretty massive. So if you are a typist and have some skill at word processing, we could certainly use your help. As I begin to revise these documents, I would love to have them particularly scanned into an electronic unit if you can, and then we could manipulate them from there, or I'm happy to rewrite and correct all my misspellings. So anyway, if you're interested in the preservation project, let me know. One of the things I spent some time on then yesterday under the title Sacraments of Weakness was the importance of symbols in sacraments. Symbols. Sacraments are ways in which we outwardly express our belief in something that's internal. And that essentially is our belief that Christ is present in every aspect of our lives. And again, as Roman Catholics, we do that in 7 sacraments. I'm focusing on the 2 that especially deal with weakness. But in the introduction to all of these lessons on sacraments, I mentioned symbols. And symbols are used in our ceremonies, in our rituals. They're used really in our everyday life too. I mentioned the symbol of the heart, as an expression of an abstract idea, namely love. But we use symbols all the time. Another reason, for wearing the lab coat today. Again, symbolically in solidarity, as I mentioned, with people that are working in hospitals. But badges, uniforms, We use symbols all the time. You get in a car, drive down the street, and there's a symbol. If it's bright red, you stop. If it's bright green, then you go. If it's a bright yellow, you're cautioned. There's symbols, and we use symbols all the time to succinctly express something. Well, of the 10 that I mentioned yesterday, I want to come back to a couple of them that are going to be particularly pertinent as we talk about the sacrament of reconciliation. Yesterday was the sacrament of anointing. We use mainly the symbol of oil, but also candle, also robes. Sometimes use incense in the sacrament of anointing. Just depends on the setting. But today, let's remember that I listed hands as one of those symbols. The imposition of hands, the extension of hands is one of the things that would be an element, as we'll see, in the sacrament of reconciliation. One of the reasons people say, can I go to confession over the telephone? And the answer is no, because we want the personal interaction. That'll become clearer as I talk about the role of the priest as the symbol of the community present, as the symbol of the presence of Christ, who said, where 2 or 3 of you are gathered in my name, I am with you. So the symbol of hands. I use robes sometimes. Many times a person will say, Father, will you hear my confession? You know, or you'll say that to a priest, and the priest will say, yes, let me get my stole. And he puts the stole on. That's one of the robes. It's one of the symbolic pieces of garment, you know, that we use in this sacrament particularly. We're going to be doing a good bit of history of the sacrament of reconciliation today. And I gave you a hint about that yesterday when I said that the experience of the sacrament of reconciliation as we know it today, particularly as individuals, was born in the midst of a pandemic, the European bubonic plague, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about that. But the sacrament of reconciliation individually is not something that we had from the beginning of the church. We had the authorization. Jesus authorized the apostles to forgive sin, but it didn't typically happen all the time as an individual. We'll go into some of that. We'll go into the way that individual confession developed, and we'll go into some of the specifics of how it developed, why those specifics were there, and perhaps how they somewhat outlived their usefulness. So reconciliation is our word nowadays for the sacrament of confession. It's also been called the sacrament of penance. By its very title, reconciliation means to be one with again. Re is the again part. Con is with, you know that word. Chili con carne, chili with meat. Con is with. And ciliate means to be in harmony with. So to be one with again is what reconciliation means. Jesus, because of his love for us, became human like us. He promised to be with us always, and he is. It's up to us to be aware of his presence. And the more we know Christ, the more we can be aware of his presence in all of our experiences. We experience physical and emotional weakness. He shares our pain. We experience moral weakness. He understands our failings. He is one with us, and he tells us that we can be one with him. Another way I like to put it is we can define those very human experiences in terms of Jesus. And I come face to face with the fact of my imperfections, both as an individual and as a community of people. When I come face to face with that imperfection, I can understand it in terms of Jesus. I'm called on to be a forgiving person. A lot of times people get caught up in the need to forgive someone else. And they'll often say, well, I guess I haven't forgiven that person because I can't forget it. And that's an important lesson to spend some time on, too. I often have given homilies on that. That just because we haven't forgotten something doesn't mean that we haven't forgiven. Jesus says we have to forgive. He understands that we can't forget. And I know that I'm digressing just a little bit, but it's a pretty important thing that is experienced by a lot of people. And so I use this formula. I counsel people who say, I can't get over that. I can't forget what my older brother did to me. I can't forget what my uncle did. I can't forget the way that somebody cheated me in that business dealing. I can't get over that. I can't forget the fact that the settlement of my parents' estate was unfair. I was hurt. Can't forget those things. So have I not forgiven? I usually say, here's my definition of forgiving. If I surrender my right to hurt somebody back, then I'm on the way to forgiveness. I'll often say to somebody, okay, so you're really angry at that person. Do you want to hurt them? Do you want them to have harm? And most often, the person will say, no, I don't want to hurt them. I don't want them to have harm. Then I'll say, okay, then you're on the way to forgiveness. But you don't necessarily forget it. A lot of times I quote to people a line that comes from Shakespeare's tragic play, King Lear. Today's happens to be Shakespeare's birthday, April 23rd. But Shakespeare, in that play, uses the expression more sinned against than sinning. More sinned against than sinning. A lot of times when I'm experiencing one-on-one confession with people, we touch on that topic. And a person's coming with their anger at someone else, perhaps, and maybe they're feeling guilty about that anger. Many times they are more sinned against than sinning. What I'm suggesting to you is that's something that you can bring to confession too, when you have those feelings yourself. Again, did you catch my definition? Jesus tells us he is one with us. That's what it means to be reconciled, to find meaning in our human condition. You don't have to be a scripture scholar to read through and know that our Savior was more sinned against than sinning. He experienced all of the human condition. Sacrament of Reconciliation has experienced a lot of change throughout the history of Catholicism. And so it's been known by several names. Sacrament of Penance, Sacrament of Peace, Sacrament of Atonement, Atonement. Write that one up. At one mint. There's your reconciliation idea again. Sacrament of Confession. Now we're going to go into some of the history of the Sacrament of Reconciliation. For the first 600 years of our church's history, reconciliation, the forgiveness of sin, took place at the beginning of Mass, and that is not unfamiliar to us. Okay, again, the first 600 years of our church's history, Mass began, as it does now, with the phrase, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy, that little litany, which a lot of times people think of as being in Latin, but it's actually Greek. Kyrie eleison. You will hear it sung often. Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison is the Greek language, and that would have been recited at the beginning of Masses. Now, the only time there would have been individual reconciliation would be what's called the deathbed confession. And we actually touched on that a bit yesterday when we were talking about extreme unction, or the anointing of the sick at death. That had an element of reconciliation to it too. The 7th century, we were beginning to have monasticism, or monasteries. Monasticism started, it started, there were monks actually in the time of Jesus, but Christian monasticism really has its big kick in the 400s, 5th century, and Saint Benedict is considered the father, at least, of Western monasticism. There were others before him, but like, for example, Saint Anthony of the Desert. But Saint Benedict of a place called Monte Cassino, Italy. He was actually born in, a city in Italy called Nursia. So Saint Benedict wrote a rule or a guide for living in monastic life, living in community life. That's called the Rule of Saint Benedict. And so monasteries were going pretty strong in the 5th, 6th, 7th century. You get to the 7th century and the monasteries of Ireland in particular, British Isles, those monks began to encourage the practice of individual confession. So we go fully 600 years in our church's history before we get to individual confessions, and we have the Irish monks to thank for that. They began to encourage people individually to talk about weakness, to talk about wrongdoing, to talk about God's forgiveness. And same practice of talking individually, one-on-one, about weakness and the need for forgiveness hit Europe a few centuries later. Particularly in the 11th, 12th centuries, mainland Europe was experiencing confession one-on-one, not just in monasteries, although in many instances the monastery church was also the church to which the townspeople came for their masses and their instruction and so on. But in parishes in the 11th and 12th century, you begin to see individual confessions. And then a real need for individual confession, and the shape it took, I've already mentioned this, the shape it took that came all the way down to modern times came about as a result of a deadly disease that spread throughout Europe. Our rates of fatality to COVID-19 are high, but 2/3 of Europe, upwards of a half to 2/3 of Europe, was killed by the bubonic plague. And that lasted, not for a matter of months, but for about a century. 2 out of every 3 people, whole families, whole towns were wiped out. People spent more time going to burials than anything else. Burials were often in groups. It was just awful what happened in the bubonic plague. And one of the most awful parts of the plague, though, one of the lasting results, was how it caused people to think. They began to think that God must hate humans because God was making humans suffer and die because they were wicked. And people became very afraid of God. They became convinced that they would not only suffer in pain during this life, but that eternity would be a painful hell because God hated human beings. God was a wrathful, vengeful being. They began to think that, though, that The afterlife suffering could be temporary if they experienced suffering in this life. Again, you've got a collective body of people believing that God is wrathful, vengeful, hates human beings, and punishes them and tortures them. And so they begin to think that if they can experience some suffering in this life, then that will mitigate their suffering in the next life. And so they would inflict pain on themselves. They would walk with nails or rocks in their shoes. They would wear the hair skin of animals inside their clothes. Whip themselves with ropes and cords. They believed that inflicting that kind of pain would prevent their suffering for all eternity. Parents would inflict that kind of pain on their kids. People would get together in groups not to study the scriptures or to pray with each other, but to inflict flagellations, whippings on each other. Came to be known as the flagella. And they thought they were doing a spiritual thing, inflicting pain in this life so as to avoid it in the next life. That concept just produced a whole lot of distortion of religion. And even if they were right, which of course they weren't, but even if they were right about mitigating the pain of the afterlife by taking on pain in this life, they still believed that God was hateful and mean. The church began, though, to teach about Jesus and the many times that he spoke of forgiveness. Now, this time, people were able to read the Bible a little bit more, not a whole lot, but they could read it somewhat because it was being translated into their local languages like German, English, French, and so on. But they began to realize that Jesus spoke of forgiveness. A story about the woman at the house of Simon the leper. The story about the woman who was about to have rocks thrown at her. Many others. The church pointed out that Jesus told his apostles to speak to people about God forgiving sin. And the apostles in turn handed this on to their successors, of course, the priests and bishops. In telling people of the 13th century about forgiveness, the church began to help people stop thinking about God as being mean and hateful. They began to think about God as a fair judge. A judge. Fair judge. There's a painting, if you ever find yourself at the Abbey Church of St. Ambrose, painting of God with his arms in the air, and it's called God as Judge. They have a more fancy name for it that doesn't come to me right now. But anyway, the people began to image God as a fair judge. If people were sincerely sorry for the wrongs they did, they could know about God's forgiveness. Also, instead of doing painful things to themselves, like I mentioned before, people were taught to do good things, helpful things, like prayers, litanies, visits to holy places. These would be positive things to express their sorrow and seek forgiveness. By admitting the wrongs they had done, expressing their sorrow, promising to be good in the future, people could be assured of forgiveness in this life. If they failed to achieve forgiveness in this life, it could still be accomplished after death. And forgiveness after death came to be known as purgatory. If a person did not seek forgiveness in this life or after death, then they would be separated from God forever. Biblical character named Dives. His story is told in the Gospel according to St. Luke in chapter 16. You know the story. Dives experiences torture in hell and asks God to send Moses to relieve his suffering. St. Luke chapter 16, verses 19 to 31. And he is forever separated from God and hell. This character diabetes. In order to make sure that people would ask for God's forgiveness, the church would describe the experience of purgatory and hell. In other words, you know the expression, put the fear of God in people. Well, no, the church wanted to scare people, to encourage them to seek forgiveness by letting them know how awful the punishment would be. Being separated from God, either temporarily or permanently, cannot be described. We can't picture it. We can't picture or describe being with God either. The best we can say is being separated from God is awful, and being with God is wonderful. In order, though, to make sure that people would ask God's forgiveness, the church began to describe being separated from God or being with God with pictures that people could understand. And so you get pictures of little angels floating on clouds, playing harps, and streets of gold. And you get images of fire and flames and pointy-headed characters in red with tails. People would visualize, church would visualize goodness, visualize badness. We can't do it. We can't know what it's like, but they would create these visions and cause people to have a more graphic sense of the abstract. So purgatory, temporary separation from God, and some punishment. Hell, permanent separation from God, and lots of punishment. Heaven, permanently being with God and all pleasantness. The key, though, in the 13th century, to being with God instead of being separated from God was forgiveness. And the key to forgiveness was being sincerely sorry and promising to do good. Remember, the church's prayer had always included asking God for forgiveness in Jesus. Lord have mercy, Kyrie eleison, every Mass. And since the 7th century, the Irish monks have been showing people how to do that individually, ask for forgiveness. Well, the church collectively, as a whole, decided to take that same idea of individual confession and improve on it. So the church developed the rite of individual confession. It's a ceremony which took place in a very small room, a booth really, big enough for only 2 people, one of whom was a priest. The booth was dark and had a screen which separated the 2 compartments. This is familiar to a lot of people. The priest was called the confessor, and the person receiving the sacrament of reconciliation or confession was called the penitent. So confessor and penitent. Now the task of the penitent was to describe, first of all, the amount of time since he or she had last received the sacrament, to describe the sinful things that he or she was guilty of, to express sorrow, and to promise not to do those things again. The task of the confessor was to judge how serious the things were that the penitent had confessed, to judge how sincere was the sorrow expressed, to judge whether the person was intent on not committing sin again, and to assign the penitent a spiritual chore, prayers, good deeds, and so on. And in that way, to assure the penitent of God's forgiveness. That style of the sacrament of confession, and I think it's probably sounding pretty familiar to a lot of people, some my age and older, some not as old as I am. That style of confession is sounding pretty familiar. It was firmed up, it was canonized, it was made part of the rule of how you do the sacrament of confession about 1565, and it stayed in use pretty much the way it was. Oh, I think it went from Latin to English probably somewhere in the 50s. But to 1965. So 1565 to 1965, we're doing confession pretty much the same way. And then let me catch myself there for a minute, because at least until 65, the prayer that the priest prayed was in Latin, because when the penitent expressed sorrow by reciting the act of contrition, which of course they had memorized, the priest was mumbling on the other side, and that was a Latin phrase, a Latin prayer that he was praying. So again, 400 years of that style of confession. Well, you hear my voice a little bit of criticism, and there will be more of it, because the main things I'm going to talk about is how that experience of confession lost its meaning for a lot of people. People say, why don't you go to confession anymore? Well, I think for the most part, it became less than meaningful for people. And you hear that in the way we talk about it. Do I have to go to confession? You're going to hear me say before I finish this lesson that it's not a question of having to, but getting to. We don't ask if we have to do something, if it's something we enjoy doing. If it's something we don't enjoy doing, or something we don't find any meaning in, then we think of having to do it. So, do I have to go to confession? If you know the comedian George Carlin, some of his early recordings are some of the dialogues that those of us who were raised in the 50s and 60s will remember. Because we used to ask the priest when he came into the classroom questions like, what does it take to make a sin? And do I have to confess something that is a sin? Is it a small sin or a bigger sin? A venial sin or a mortal sin? And which do I have to confess? That's how we looked upon it. George Carlin tells a hilarious story about the kid who was going to confession, and he was asking whether or not he had violated the rule to abstain from meat on Friday. And he said, if I licked the skin of a hot dog on Friday but didn't consume it, would that be a sin? We asked more seriously the same kind of question. Can you have bean soup and put ham in it on a Friday? Well, if it's only a ham broth and not a chunk of ham, then that's all right. We did that kind of mental gymnastics trying to figure out what constituted a sin and what didn't. A lot more to be said about that. But one of the things then that was part of this was to examine ourselves to see if the thing that we had done wrong had some seriousness. And the formula, as I presented it to you, had some real benefit to it, because it's a healthy thing for us, psychologically healthy for us, to come to grips with failings, to look at ourselves and admit failings, to not constantly make such demands on ourselves, that we have to be perfect, to realize that we do make mistakes and to be willing to admit those, rather than to suppress those is a psychologically healthy thing. Clinical depression has a lot to do with misdirected anger and misdirected guilt. And some of the things that medieval rite of confession did was helped us to get in touch with our ownership of guilt. Did I intentionally do that? You know, was I being less the person than I'd like to be? And the way we get in touch with that is to spell it out in specifics and to come to grips with it. Well, that particular rite of reconciliation was in some ways psychologically healthy. But, as I've already mentioned, it outlived its usefulness, and it was also open to distortion. For example, the darkness of the booth made it mysterious and scary. But then there needed to be some anonymity. The priest had to not be prejudiced. Now, we've taken away that with face-to-face confession, but many of us can remember growing up with the hope and going to confession with the hope that the priest didn't recognize our voice on the other side of the screen. And the priest needed that kind of anonymity. Unfortunately, the other side of that is you feel alone when what you need is compassion and understanding. Because the priest was in the role of judge, he had a lot of power. Where there's power, there's a temptation to misuse it. Confessor, for example, could be tempted to think that the forgiveness came from him. I mentioned that yesterday. Forgiveness comes from Jesus. Priest doesn't do the forgiving, Jesus does. But there's a temptation there when you've got that kind of power. Priest could require the penitent to do inappropriate things, like giving money in exchange for forgiveness. Probably the most lasting effect of this type of confession were these: that people said the same things over and over again, because we were told to go to confession weekly or every other week. We would say the same things over and over again, and that's one of the ways it would become less than meaningful. Another thing that was a problem was that these weak ideas were made to last too long. 400 years was a long time for that type of reconciliation. And another aspect of it was that we were taught to confess something and never confess it again. We had our little prayer books that gave us an examination of conscience. We looked through there, you know, and tried to come up with something that we didn't confess before. You get children, 3 and 3rd and 4th grade, reading those books and saying they confessed murder. They didn't know what murder was. Confessing adultery. Didn't know what adultery was, but it was listed there. So we were causing it to be less than meaningful. So it was a church council which took place at Trent in Italy in 1565 and actually started in 1545. And it gave us that form of confession and that we used for those 400 years. Another church council which took place at Vatican City in Italy, 1962 to 65, gave us the beginnings of the new way that we celebrate this sacrament. Vatican Council II said that the ways of celebrating all the 7 sacraments should be examined and improved. And about 10 years later, 1975, this began to happen with the sacrament of confession. The first improvement was to call it Sacrament of Reconciliation, because we celebrate, I'll use that word a lot, outwardly express a belief that we have in our oneness with Jesus. Reconciliation, and I gave you the etymology of it earlier, is a good word for the sacrament. We express our belief that Jesus understands our weakness and loves us in spite of it. We don't have a God who says, when you get your act together, I'll start loving you. We've got a God who loves us in spite of our failings. And we have to express our belief in that. And when we do that, it reminds us of that truth. Jesus told his apostles and their successors to speak to people about forgiveness. Priests are thus the ones who are designed and designated to help us know of Jesus' understanding. But I think the priest is also the representative of the community. His being there is a symbol that helps us to know that we're not alone, that we as a community have imperfections, and we're all in this together. We as a community find Christ in one another and with one another. And this concept of knowing that we're not alone can only be expressed, when there are at least two people there. And so the priest, not so much the one who forgives, but the one who reminds us that we're not alone. We need to know of Jesus' understanding of forgiveness and love, and the priest or bishop is the one that Jesus instructed to tell people about that message. We find that instruction in John chapter 20, Matthew chapter 18, and you know those lines particularly well because we just read them on the second Sunday after Easter, Divine Mercy Sunday. Questions of where, when, and how often to celebrate the sacrament of reconciliation are answered very much like the same questions for the sacrament of anointing. While a dark booth should no longer be used, there should be a screen or some other means where a person can be anonymous if they choose to be anonymous. What happens in the ceremony? As with anointing, the sacrament of reconciliation can happen when a large group has gathered, or it can happen when only one confessor and one penitent is present. Also, a person may wish to celebrate reconciliation in the style of what I call the recitation confession or a conversation confession. These are the elements that are typically used in this sacrament. There's a greeting, the Lord be with you. There's a sign of the cross. There's a prayer of blessing that's usually bound up in what we are, our formula, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. Most of the time, people can't start unless they say that. It's just sort of automatic with them. I'll sometimes say, just a second, I'll give you that blessing you asked for. So, greeting, sign of the cross, prayer of blessing, and then the verbal exchange between the priest and the confessor. I usually say, what do you want to get off your mind? What do you want to tell Christ that you're sorry for? Then there's a prayer of sorrow by the penitent. We call it the act of contrition. It can be a formula prayer, or it can be one that the person designs themselves. Then the prayer of absolving by the confessor, when the priest pronounces the prayer of absolution. It's usually a blessing at the end, which wraps up with the sign of the cross, and then the farewell or dismissal. In the recitation style of confession, the penitent recites those weaknesses for which he or she is expressing sorrow. I did this, I did that, I avoided this, I avoided that, I omitted this, I omitted that. And they just simply recite things. And that's an appropriate form of the sacrament of reconciliation. I call that a recitation confession. And when there is a large number of penitents gathered to go to confession, that's the style to use, a recitation confession. The other style is what I call conversation confession. And that's when the penitent and the confessor have a conversation. It's usually done by scheduling an appointment or meeting, when both have some time to have some dialogue. You can still use all of those elements that I mentioned, but it's more of a conversation than a recitation. There's a lot of people waiting for the sacrament of confession. That's not the time for a conversation confession. That's more the time for recitation. Perhaps the most important thing to remember about these sacraments of weakness is the thing that we remember about all sacraments, and that's this. Our God is present in our lives because our God became like us in Jesus. We express our belief in that presence by ritual, ceremonies, prayers, symbols. And these outward signs, these symbols, enable us to live better because they make us inwardly aware of the presence of Christ. Now that completes the lesson, but I want to add some other things in sort of a summary. And that'll include a couple of stories. We're 50 minutes into our broadcast, and I think I can do this in probably less than 10. Why did individual confession become less meaningful for people? Now you might say, well, Father, what makes you think it's not meaningful for people? Well, the answer is because there's not as many people who go to individual confession as there used to be. That's a fact. Why did it become less meaningful for people? And how does one go about making it more meaningful again? Well, the first response I want to make that confession to that question is the shift in attitude from I have to go to confession to I get to go to confession. I mentioned it earlier. If I have to do something, if I speak of it that way, then it's obviously something that I don't like to do, I don't look forward to, or something that's not meaningful. So we have to get away from the attitude of I have to. And that gets us away from all the questions of, if I put too much meat in my bean soup, is that a sin if I eat it on Friday? Get into the questions of what is a sin and what is not. Do I have to go to confession if I haven't sinned? Many times I've met people that I am convinced are saints, and yet they'll say, I would like to go to confession. They're looking for things that they want to tell about. You don't have to go to confession. If it's meaningful to you, you want to go to confession. I consider it a spiritual massage, a way of taking an inventory. Yesterday I compared it to an oil change. You don't get a whole new car when you get an oil change, but every 3,000, 3,500 miles, you change the oil. Well, I think once a quarter, we look at ourselves and say, I have imperfections. I know I have imperfections. I'll come back to that a little bit later when I speak not only of my imperfections, but of the imperfections that we have as a community. I want to tell you just a couple of stories about this experience of confession becoming less meaningful. Remember, I said something about how we were instructed to confess something and never do it again. And so we would come back each week to confession looking for something that we hadn't told. Well, a good friend, tells the story about how she went to the screen and she said, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I missed Mass intentionally on Sunday 3 times. And the voice on the other side knew who she was, and he said, "You did not miss Mass. I've seen you here every Sunday." And then there's my experience. Again, the notion that you confess something and never do it again. We were taught that that's what you have to do. And so, as a seminary student in graduate school, my early 20s, I was dealing with impure thoughts and impure actions, just as anybody else my age would be. And I went to see a priest. The fellow had been ordained 60 years. He was in his mid-80s. He was well known for his great spirituality. And I went in with my frustrations, and I said, Father Anselm, when am I going to get past these bad habits that I have? When am I going to stop giving in to these impure thoughts? I do all the things that you tell us here in the seminary. I say my prayers, and I do the readings about the saints, and do all that I can to avoid those temptations. And sometimes I do pretty well, and I'll go for maybe 2 or 3 weeks even, and then I'll fall again. It's 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And Father Anselm, when will I stop having trouble? When will I accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish and root these sins out of my life? And he said, about 30 minutes after you die. It was a life lesson to remind myself that as long as I'm a human being, I'll have my faults. One more story about individual confession in the dark booth. And this one, of course, is completely made up. But the story goes, the fellow hadn't been to confession for a long time. And so he goes into the booth. The light is dim, but nonetheless, you can tell that there's little bottles of cognac, wine, very fine bourbons. There's Belgian chocolates, gourmet nuts, beautiful cheeses, nice cigars, just finest of treats. And when the indicator comes on from the other side, letting him know that the priest is there, he says, well, Father, it's been a while since I've been to confession. And I must say, things have really improved. I must say that the confession booth is not what it once was. And the voice on the other side said, stupid, you're on my side. It's hard to tell jokes when you don't have a live audience. Well, just one more lesson to leave you with. And that's, again, under the topic of how do I find meaning again in my confession. One of the things that, again, we do here at St. Ambrose, St. Ignatius, is we have our communal celebration of reconciliation. So that once a quarter, we're all reminded of our imperfections. And we experience the sacrament of reconciliation. And I tell people, next time you go individually, remember this one, because that was your last time for confession. But individual confession can also be a time for us to look at collective sinfulness. And so when I experience individual confession, I'm very mindful of sins in which I participate, but not in a direct way. For example, I confess the sin of clergy sex abuse. By the grace of God, I've never abused anybody, myself. But that doesn't mean that I can't go to confession and say, God, I'm sorry for the sins of abuse that I am connected to. Because after all, I'm a priest too. I may not be personally guilty, but I can still ask your forgiveness. Beginning of Lent this year, I mentioned the idea of giving up chocolate, and I suggested the idea too of being aware of systemic abuse of people who grow the chocolate, who work in the factories, who are abused or misused or exploited because of what they can do for a company. The sin of systemic exploitation, whether it be people who are working or whether it be of the environment. We can confess that individually. I can go to my individual experience of confession and say, and Father, I am sorry that we live in a world that exploits our natural resources. I'm sorry for the collective sins that we experience. Maybe I've never been involved at all in an abortion, but I can say, God, I ask for forgiveness. It's a concept known as reparation that we used to talk about a lot. And we can make reparation for sins that we're not directly involved in, but nonetheless are a part of, because we're a part of this human condition. That's what our sacrament of weakness is about. Recognizing that we have our membership in this human condition, this collective body of people, but the collective body of Christ redeems that. Helps us to understand that we are loved by God, and that our better selves can come forward. We recognize our feelings, know that we are redeemed, know that we are forgiven, know that we are loved, and know that the one who teaches us that, Jesus Christ, our Lord, is with us all the days of our lives. God bless you, everybody. Thanks for your attention to this. I'll get together with Karen and probably move now to back to the memoir. I'd like to read some more of that to you. And again, if you're skilled with word processing or can help us with restoring and collecting the lesson plans, sure love to hear from you. Love to hear from you anyway. God bless. That's a wrap.